So I have the great pleasure to introduce today's plenary speaker. She's about to enter the stage. Oh, sorry, don't touch my paper. Then I won't know what to say. So I want to introduce Lata Gangadharan from Monash University. She is the Joe Isaac Chair of Business and Economics at Monash Business School and a professor at the Department of Economics. And she will talk about compliance in social dilemmas, insights from experiments, where I think the focus will be on sort of how to improve compliance with environmental regulations. Before I let Lata give her the floor, let me just say a few words. To be selected as a plenary speaker at the World Congress is not a simple achievement. I would say it seems like it's even more difficult than becoming a president of a large supernation in this world. We worked hard, we vetted candidates, we looked at YouTube videos, we read papers, we had dinners and talked a lot with people, and the lineup we ended up with is a lineup that we are extremely proud of. Moving over more specifically to Lata, as you all know, hopefully know, she has made very important contributions to the field, and in particular I find sort of her applying the experimental framework to environmental economics, but also to behavioral and experimental economics, has been extremely fruitful. She was very early on using an experimental approach to say something about environmental policy, and to say something about institutions in general, and the role of institutions and how institutions should be designed. She's also been very important for the academic community, both as the person she is, but also as serving as an editor for a number of journals over the years, including American Journal of Agricultural Economics and Experimental Economics. Lastly, I would say, and this maybe is the most impressive thing, is sort of the respect that she has from her peers. So when we were talking with people and after we announced the plenary speakers, we only got sort of positive feedback that we picked Lata as a plenary speaker, emphasizing the things I've just stressed. So I would like to hand over to you, Lata. I'm looking forward to both an educational and inspiring work. I actually also hope it's a little bit provocative, because I do think it's important that we teach the world that the scientific approach is to be provocative, the scientific approach is to disagree with each other and communicating in order to make the world better. So please, Lata.
Thank you, Frederick, for the very generous introduction. Thanks also for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, giving a plenary talk at the World Congress. And I also would like to take the opportunity to thank all the organizers for organizing and hosting such a wonderful conference. The program looks amazing, and I'm looking forward to going to many of the sessions. So what I'm going to talk today is about compliance, and this is going to relate to compliance and social dilemmas. And I'm going to look at this topic from the lens of experimental and behavioral economics. So environmental economics at its core is a study of externalities. There are several examples of externalities around us. There is one here where you have smoke coming out of smokestacks in factories, and this is actually, unfortunately, a common sight in many parts of the world even today. This next picture is about the Sitaram River in Indonesia, and you can see the domestic and the waste and the industrial waste, because there are lots of textile factories along the river. You can see this waste in the figure as well. And this has led to a huge impact on the marine life there and also on the livelihoods of many people who depend on this river. The next picture is about the iconic Ganges River in India. And this river has been really polluted over the years, and the government of India has tried to do many things to try and clean up this river, and it has not been very successful. And now the contamination from this river is spreading to the local groundwater system. So that's going to have a deadly impact on people who live near the river. And this last picture is from Australia, where lots of the native trees have been cleared over the years, and this has been replaced by crops which have very short roots, and that has had a huge impact on salinity. So the salt has increased in the soil, and this has many environmental implications. So in addition to studying the nature of such externalities, what we do in environmental economics is also study different interventions and regulations. So we design different regulations to try and reduce these externalities. Of course, the problem is that even the best designed regulation might be not very effective if you don't really have adequate enforcement and monitoring. Policymakers are aware of this problem, and they are often eager to find good solutions. In particular, they are eager to find cost-effective ways to improve compliance amongst firms and individuals. And why cost-effective? Because obviously, as we know, enforcement and monitoring can be very expensive, and it can be quite hard on the budget. So cost-effective becomes really important in this case. So this brings us to a fundamental question in this literature: why should firms and individuals comply with regulations? So in 1968, Gary Becker introduced the concept of optimal compliance into the economics literature. And this idea of optimal compliance rests on the concept of costs and benefits that people are going to evaluate when they decide whether they want to get involved in a criminal activity. And from that, you can determine the optimal compliance and the optimal penalties that you should have in this kind of a setting. And it also helps us understand how much resources should you spend on crime prevention. Now, this idea has been explored and extended in many different dimensions by many researchers, and there's a rich body of literature that explores the economics of compliance. And this has been nicely summarized in an article by Polensky and Chavo in 2000, they survey the early theoretical literature in this area. The environmental literature on compliance has closely followed this concept of optimal compliance and optimal penalties. And there are lots of very nice contributions in this area which are very insightful. And now there are lots of, there are a few surveys also by J. Shimshak, by Gray and Shimshak, and by Cohen in 1999. And these surveys actually critically analyze the theoretical and the empirical literature on compliance. The focus of many of the papers in this body of work has been on the incentives at the individual level or at the firm level. There's not been a lot of focus on the impact of those individual actions on others. So the social dilemma in many of these cases is not explicitly modeled. Okay? And that brings me to the focus of today's talk. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the incentives to comply in two different settings where there is an explicit social dilemma. And I'm going to mainly talk about two projects. And both of these are co-authored with Tim Kaysen and Lana Friesen. Tim is in the audience somewhere. And Lana is back in Australia. And I'm going to talk about these two projects. So the first project is where I'm going to focus on firms' actions and how these actions, and these are relating to compliance, so these compliance actions, how are they going to affect their own earnings, and also, of course, they affect others' earnings in the group. And in this context, I'm going to try and understand how regulators can try and get these firms to comply with regulations. So there are two schemes that we are going to be suggesting. One is a scheme that depends on competition. So it has got its roots in competition. So that's an audit tournament where firms are going to be competing with each other to try and not get audited. Okay? And the other dimension that I'm going to look at today is the social information and how, by providing information about other people's actions, that could potentially have an impact on your compliance behavior. Okay, so this could be a positive impact or a negative impact, and it's something that we're going to study empirically. In the second project, I'm going to use a principal-agent setting. And in this setting, we'll have an agent who is going to be taking some actions, but these actions can have a negative impact, not just on the principal in the principal-agent relationship, but also on others in the group. Okay? The problem is going to be that the action is unobservable. So now, it's going to be really tricky to find a way to incentivize the agent to do what is good for society. Okay, so the idea here would be to think of contracts, wage contracts, where the principal can incentivize the agent so that the agent does not take an action which can lead to an environmental accident. So as I said before, in both settings, we are going to have a social dilemma that is created. That is basically, there is going to be a tension between individual interests and the interests of society. And both are going to use economic experiments. In particular, the focus is going to be on lab experiments today. Okay, so let me just give you a quick roadmap of what I'm going to do. We talked about motivations, so the next is going to be the usefulness that I think the usefulness of economic experiments to try and understand issues relating to compliance, and I'm also going to highlight some of the findings from this literature. I'll talk about the first project, as I said, and then the second project, and then I'll have hopefully some time to talk about some general insights from this literature and from our two projects. And hopefully there'll be some time for questions as well. Okay, so in terms of methodology, economic experiments can be very well suited to try and understand issues related to environmental compliance. And there are many good reasons for this. One is that it's easier to measure non-compliance in the lab and also to measure the externality that this non-compliance creates. So people who are not being compliant with regulations, they usually don't go around revealing themselves to you, or they don't disclose their actions. It's actually quite hard to find out who they are and what they're doing and why they're not complying. And also key variables such as the probability of inspections or the penalties are often not known to researchers if you're using observational data. And in the experiment, obviously, you can design your parameters, so obviously the researchers are going to have access to these variables. Also, importantly, in experiments, these penalties, if subjects are not complying with regulations, and these are actual penalties that they face because there are economic incentives for these subjects. Okay, so subjects are paid in the experiment depending on their actions. So if they get a fine, then that amount of money is going to be deducted from their earnings. So it is an actual salient decision that they are making in the experiment. The other aspect is that other regarding preferences, such as reciprocity and social motives, can be more easily observed in the lab. With observational studies, it can be more difficult to measure these kind of other regarding preferences. You may have noisy measures in some cases, and in other cases, it might be just really hard to isolate these impacts. And this can be quite useful, particularly if your research objective is such that you want to figure out what are the causal motives behind compliance actions. So for example, if you want to, you can design treatments where you can separate out reciprocity versus altruism to undertake an action. Okay? And this can be quite useful to understand behavior. So in general, in the case of many policy questions, not just in compliance, but in general, often the data required for empirical testing is just not available. It's not available in a timely fashion, and in some cases, it's not available at all. So lab then provides perhaps the only opportunity to explore different policy options and to figure out what the counterfactuals are. And even in situations where theory and empirical evidence is available, lab experiments can be useful because they can help us test the robustness of our results to behavioral factors. And in some cases, you can uncover unanticipated behavior that can undermine the success of a policy. So I would say that experiments are very useful. It's a useful complement to observational studies, and in some cases, they can be an essential methodology in the economics toolkit. And in particular, there are some research questions that are going to be very hard to answer without this methodology. And perhaps because of this, and I guess lots of you have already realized this, and perhaps because of this, there has been an explosion of research using experimental methods in this area of environmental economics, to the extent that now we have several survey papers that summarize the influence of experiments in addressing environmental issues. I should also mention that in the program here, there are lots of sessions where people are presenting experimental methods and behavioral methods with respect to environment. So it'll be good to attend those sessions and find out what they're doing. In the context of lab experiments, as I said, there are several surveys. I guess the history of lab experiments in this area is a bit longer. And I'm not going to talk about each of these papers, but I do want to highlight one of the papers, which is also the recent paper in this list. And this is a paper by Tim Kaysen and Stephen Wu. And what they do is they explore important methodological questions in this area. In particular, they talk about subject pool. So what is the right subject pool to use to address different kinds of questions in this environmental and agricultural economics area? And they suggest that if your research question is closely tied to economic theory, then using student subjects is really valuable. It helps in decreasing the noise and the variance in the data, and it importantly also helps in replication. So replication, as we know, is key in economics and science, and lab experiments can be very useful in this area because it can help us build on each other's work and learn from that. Okay? There are also lots of very nice field experiments. And again, in the program, I noticed there were several nice papers on this. And there are now also survey papers that critically discuss this area. The papers by Price and List and Price mainly talk about experiments, environmental field experiments in developed countries. And the paper that I've co-authored with Daniel Brent, Lana Friesen, and Andreas Lebrand, we talk about both developed and developing countries, and in particular, our focus is on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which is actually quite important in the environmental area. And we interpret these results from these field experiments using a theoretical lens. So, there's a section in the paper where we provide some kind of a theoretical framework to try and understand these results from field experiments. Okay, so this is an emerging literature, and there are lots of very interesting things that are going on in this area. Okay, so let me very quickly talk about some insights from the experimental literature. This was actually hard for me to choose because to me there are lots of insights, so I'm going to just focus on the ones that relate to compliance and enforcement. But very quickly, I do want to mention that there is this huge literature which has used experiments and behavioral methods to study emissions trading, conservation auctions, water markets, and I know that several of you here have worked on that area. And the body of research in that area has had a huge impact in terms of policy. In Australia, I know that the Bush Tender program has been very much influenced by the experiments that researchers have done. The acid rain market was influenced by some of the experimental work that has been done in that area. And also the European emissions trading market has been informed by experiments as well. So that has been a very productive area which has used experiments and behavioral methods. So I'm going to though focus on the compliance and enforcement area before I start talking about these two projects. So one of the puzzles in the compliance and enforcement area is that firms often comply with regulations even though the audit probabilities and the fines when people are caught are low. Now, this is a puzzle because if you go back to the optimal compliance framework, then people are going to think about costs and benefits. So if the probability of getting caught and if the fines are very low, then why should you bother to comply? Right? But empirical evidence shows that many people do comply. So how do you reconcile the theory and the empirical evidence in this area? So there have been several ways suggested to reconcile this puzzle. And one of the ways is to think about a dynamic enforcement model. And this was suggested by Harrington way back in 1988. And this is actually a simple idea where people can be, or firms can be put into groups. You can have a good group and a bad group. And this can be based on your historical compliance history. And you can have, so in the good group, the firms are going to be rarely inspected. And in the bad group, they're going to be frequently inspected. So the idea behind this model is that compliance is achieved in the bad group, although the expected penalty is very small, because firms know that if they're good in the bad group, then they can be allowed to go back to the good group. Okay? So this is basically the regulator trying to leverage the firms to comply with these regulations. Okay? So the simple prediction here is that low-cost firms in the bad group are going to always be in compliance, high-cost firms are not going to be in compliance, and medium-cost firms are going to go in and out depending on recent inspections. So what does experiments, what is the evidence from experiments? Do they support this, this theory? So there has been some work which looks at this dynamic enforcement model. There was work by Jeremy Clark, Lana Friesen, and Andy Mueller in 2004, and Tim and I have done some work on it several years back now in 2006. And overall, what we find is that violations with the rule do rise when theory predicts, the theory being the dynamic enforcement theory. But in some cases, they do differ considerably from predictions. So I've got a figure up here from our paper way back in 2006, and there's a lot of information here, so I'm just going to highlight the parts that I think would be relevant. So in this paper, we had some multiple treatments, one where the compliance cost was varied, and one where the probability of moving back and forth across the groups was varied. So the bars that you see here, they are specific for each treatment. And importantly, there are these two groups. There is group 1 on this side and group 2 on this other side here. Okay, so group 2 is to the left of my side, perhaps right for you. And what you find, and the blue bars are the predictions from theory. And the red stripes are what we find in the experiments. Okay, so as you can see, in many cases, the blue bars and the red stripes, they don't really coincide much. Okay, so the theory, so this is what I mean by saying that in the group 2, the bad group, they do differ considerably from predictions. And we wondered why this would be, and we conjectured whether it could be that participants are boundedly rational. And what does that mean? This means that they could be making some errors in decisions, and we decided to adopt a model, which is a quantile response model, where people are less likely to make errors that are more costly. Okay, and we try and see if this model fits the data better than the dynamic enforcement model, and that's what is shown in the green bars there. And you can see for group 2, the green bars track the stripes better than what the blue bars do. Okay, so the theory that includes this noisy behavior is better at predicting actual behavior or real behavior. And this is interesting for us because it suggests that how people act at the margin where you might be indifferent and you might choose to comply or not, that can be actually very important for the success of these policies. So another explanation of this puzzle, of this compliance puzzle, is given by Scott Gilpatrick, Christian Vossler, and Michael McGee in a very nice paper, where they suggest that competitive audit schemes would be one way to reconcile this puzzle. And what they find is that you don't need dynamic kind of models. Static models are enough as long as you incorporate competition. Okay, so this is competition where firms are competing with each other so that they don't get audited. So this is a figure from their paper. And again, it's a rich paper. There are lots of things happening, and I might not do justice to their work. So I just want to highlight a couple of things here. The black, solid, horizontal lines are the theoretical predictions in each of these treatments. So each of these bars is a separate treatment. They have 8 treatments in the paper. So all we need to do is to look at the theoretical bars and see whether all of this data from the experiments, is that tracking the theory well or not. So the solid gray bars and the solid black bars are the ones where subjects compete with each other. So that's a competitive audit scheme. And the stripes and the bars with a stripe is where there is no competition. And you can see that the solid bars are tracking the theoretical prediction bit better than the stripes. Okay, so basically, the idea here is that competitive schemes can be quite effective in increasing compliance. So what we do in this first project is we try and explore this idea more, and we put this in the setting of a social dilemma, and we also include social information. Okay, so as I said before, this is joint work with Tim, who's at Purdue University in the US, and Lana Friesen, who is at University of Queensland in Australia. And I should mention that this is available, this has been published a couple of years back, and this is available in the public domain. Okay, so our focus here was on the competitive audit mechanism and its interplay with social observability. So why do we think that making actions visible can have an impact on compliance behavior? There's several channels via which social information can work. One of the channels is shame. The other one is prestige, status. It could also be things like corporate social responsibility, where firms feel that it's important for their reputation to do the right thing. Okay? So individuals, if they are revealed to be violating the social norm of complying, then that might induce some shame in them. And similarly, if they are revealed as being compliant with regulations, then that could be something which leads to prestige or status. Okay? So when we started this project, we were curious about how many firms actually do get inspected or do get audited every year. So this figure here tells us exactly that. And this is information actually from the survey article by Jay Shimshak, and this was published in 2014. This looks this documents inspections made by the US EPA, so these are federal inspections, over the years 1994 to 2011. And this is for the 4 main programs that they regulate. They regulate many other programs, as Gina was telling us yesterday. But the 4 main programs that I have information for here are the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. Okay, so there are lots of interesting patterns in this data, but basically what I would like to highlight is that on an average, we have about 4,000 to 4,500 of inspections happening in each of these programs every year. Okay? So, but now let's think of the universe of firms which are being regulated. So just for the Clean Air Act, there are about 24,000 firms or facilities, major facilities, that are under regulation. So out of those 24,000, 4,000 are being inspected in the Clean Air Act. So you can understand that for the regulator, this is a really difficult decision. Which firm to regulate? How do you use, what kind of criteria do you use to regulate firms, right? So in our paper here, we're going to look at 2 specific criteria. One is a random criteria, so that's just simple. And what we do is that inspections are random, and there's just a constant and exogenous probability of being inspected. The second one uses some kind of a target, and the target is using the actions of the firms. And here we have endogenous audits. In particular, these are tournaments where firms are going to compete to not be audited. Okay? And the US EPA and the Internal Revenue Service have already been thinking of different kinds of programs, audit programs, where they would be using information about firms. So this has some empirical relevance as well. So what we do is we study both misreporting in this kind of a framework and also what is the level of emissions. Okay, because that's what the underlying behavior is, and that can have a huge social impact. So I'll quickly go through the framework, but not spend too much time on it, but just so that you can get a sense of what you're trying to do here and what the treatments mean. So we have a framework where firms basically make 2 decisions. They decide on the level of emissions and how much of those emissions to actually report. Okay, so they have an incentive to not report too much because reporting is expensive. So if you decide to report, there is a per unit cost that you have to incur for reporting. Okay. They would like to emit more because they get a private benefit from emitting. You can think of it as money that they don't have to spend on abatement, for example. Okay. But the problem, of course, is that these emissions are harmful to society. So we have Y, capital Y, being a function of all the emissions by the firms in the group. Okay, so there is a social harm that is caused by these emissions. So basically, actions that benefit an individual are going to impose a negative externality on society. And this creates a social dilemma, which basically requires regulation and, in some sense, also provides a role for our social information treatment. So the firm is going to have, there's a certain probability that the firm is going to be inspected, and this is going to depend upon your actions, which is emissions and reporting, and other people's actions and their other people's actions, right? So in the case of the random treatment, I think this doesn't, This perhaps doesn't show very well, so I'm not going to bother to use this one. So in the random treatment, this probability is going to be constant, but in the tournament treatment, the probability of inspection is going to be increasing in the degree of underreporting. Okay? And as in most of these cases, you would obviously have a fine if you don't report, and if you're detected, if you're audited and then you are not complying, then you would have to pay a fine, and this would be a function which depends on Y and R. So using this kind of a simple framework, what we do is we derive some treatments, and we also then derive some hypotheses for these treatments. So our treatments vary across 2 dimensions. One is the audit dimension, which is random and tournament, and the other one is the information dimension. So there's low information about other people's actions, and in the other one we have high information about other people's actions. Participants are in fixed group, so they're always in the same group, and there are 5 people in that group. They make decisions 25 times, so that's what we call periods in the experimental literature. So in each period, they're going to make 2 decisions, one on emissions and one on reporting. So the way we operationalize random audits in this experiment is that 2 out of these 5 people in the group are going to be inspected every period. And these people are randomly selected. So in the tournament treatment as well, there are 2 who are going to be inspected, but now the criteria is going to be different. So now the criteria would be their actions. So the regulator is going to have to guess what their emissions are and also look at their reports to figure out what the gap is. Okay? So this is a screenshot from what they see in these treatments at the end of the period. So after they have made their decisions for a particular period, they get to see the decisions of others in the group as well. So in all sessions, they are told their own inspection outcome. So this is so this column here is you, and they have all the information about themselves, obviously, but they also have some information about others, for example, whether others have been inspected or not. And they also have information about how much of the emissions have been reported. Okay? And we tried to do this because we thought the no information case is really not empirically relevant. In most programs that you see in the field, firms do have some information about what other firms are doing, right? So we wanted to base it in the same way. So this is a screenshot from a low information treatment. Now let's go to a high information treatment. So the main change here is that you get more information, obviously, and you also get to see the photographs of the other people in your group. Okay, so the photographs here are blurred, and that's for a good reason, because IRB and ethics in human research, they don't allow us to show these photographs in presentations for privacy concerns. But of course, in the experiment, they do get to see the photographs very clearly. Okay? And so in this treatment, in addition to the photographs, they also see the outcomes of the people who have been inspected. Okay? So you can see these columns having more information. So these are all blurred because we don't, so these are screenshots that we gave them in the instructions, and we didn't want to frame, their actual decision, so we don't show the numbers at all. Okay, so given this framework and these treatments, we could derive some hypotheses, and in our case, the emission level chosen would be the same in the random and the tournament treatment, and this is mainly because our tournaments are based on misreporting. Okay, so this may not be true if they were just based on reporting, but ours is misreporting, which is emissions and reporting. In the case of hypothesis 2, we find that misreporting is greater in the random enforcement treatment as compared to the tournament treatment. So now we look at the empirical data to see if these hypotheses are going to be supported or not. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about these channels of social observability, because I think this is very interesting, and there are some there's some possibility of future research in these areas. So in case of social observability, there are many different channels by giving people more information about others is going to have an impact. So one of the aspects is that when you reveal the identity and give more information, this could increase the stigma in the high information treatment, and therefore, we will see a decrease in misreporting. On the other hand, when you give information about other people, this also gives you some information about how many people are actually evading these regulations, right? And it also helps people update beliefs about social norms. So this may actually lead to an increase or decrease of bad behavior. It's not very clear. Okay? So it just depends on what is the social norm in your particular group. So it's possible, though, previous evidence seems to suggest that the net effect of information could be positive. So we are going to see what happens in our data. And we were also interested in this interplay of these different aspects, the audit aspect and the social information aspect. So we have some conjectures about what we would expect in this, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but maybe I should mention the one for the tournament, because that's what is really quite exciting and different and could have some important policy implications as well. So in the tournament, it's very interesting because when you have greater misreporting, so if I misreport more, that's going to benefit you because of the fact that I would be targeted by the regulatory authority. Okay, so I'm in a sense helping you. So when I give information, when we all have information about this, then possibly the negative stigma from high misreporting has been countered because of the fact that I'm actually helping others in the group by sacrificing myself or taking all the blame myself and letting myself be audited instead of you. Right? So this creates an interesting dynamic here and could lead to, in some sense, some perverse results. Okay, so but overall, we expect that social observability is going to help in improving outcomes in the random treatment. In the tournament treatment, the effect can be ambiguous. Okay? So let us look at some results from this project. I'm just going to give you just a few results and just highlight the main aspects. And also, I'll just show pictures, and but of course, there's a lot of support from parametric and non-parametric tests and regressions which confirm these results. Okay? So this is a time series of emissions. So if you remember, we had 25 decision-making periods. And what we have here is these 4 treatments. We had these 2 dimensions, so it's a 2x2 design. So there are 4 treatments, and you can see these 4 lines here. And the emissions are modestly higher in the random treatment than in the tournament treatment. So the horizontal line there is the prediction according to Nash equilibrium. Okay? So the prediction according to the social optimum is much lower. So for society, it's much better to have lower emissions. So in our framework, it was 20 units, whereas the Nash prediction was 30 units. And you can see that all the treatments are clustered around the Nash prediction. Okay? And also importantly, information treatment does not affect emissions. And for the random audits, the emissions are significantly above the Nash prediction. For the tournament, they're somewhere in between the Nash and the social equilibrium. The second aspect that we focus on here is the misreporting, and there are several different ways of defining misreporting. So I'm just going to show you one measure here. And this is a measure where you have emissions minus report, and that's what we define as misreport here. And if it is positive, then that indicates that people are underreporting their emissions. And we find that 76% underreport their emissions. Okay? So this is, again, the time series of these misreports. And for the random treatment, you can see that the misreports are much higher as compared to the tournament, I think 3 times higher. And importantly, they're also moving away from each other. So the tournament is more stable, but the random treatment, it's going way up, right? So it's getting worse, basically. Again, information treatments have no impact on misreporting. Another way to think of this data is to look at severe underreporting. And severe underreporting actually can be quite crucial in the environmental area because it can have important environmental implications. So what we find is that severe underreporting is rare in the tournaments. So this is, on the x-axis, we have percentage underreported. And the first panel is for the random treatment, and the other one is for the tournament treatment. And you can see that for the random treatment, there are many observations where underreporting is at the maximum level. And whereas for the tournament, you don't see many such high misreports. Okay? And if you think about the low levels of misreporting, then in 40% of the observations in the tournament, less than 10% are maximum possible misreports. Okay, so that's these graphs here, which are close to 0. So 0 to 10%. So it seems as if tournament is doing well in many different dimensions. So let me just quickly summarize the findings from this project. What we found was that audit tournaments are effective at reducing both misreporting and emissions. Now, if you remember, in our framework, we were not expecting that tournaments are going to be effective in the emissions front as well. So it's quite encouraging to see that there are benefits beyond truthful reporting. Tournaments also seem to reduce negative externality generating emissions as compared to the random inspection treatment. There could be several reasons why this is. It could be because, again, subjects are not quite sure which one to reduce, so they end up increasing their reports, but also they end up decreasing their emissions. So they know that it's the gap that matters, but they don't really know which one they should be fiddling with in some sense, right? And that's true for many firms in the field as well. And this could also be because of the fact that we have a social dilemma in this case, and perhaps the tournament, even though it's a competitive arena, it makes people more aware of each other because they're comparing themselves with each other, and because of that, they seem to do better in the social setting as well. They feel that they should be emitting less because they are more aware of the others in the group. In the random treatment, it's basically you're on your own. Right? You're just being inspected. You face a constant probability of being inspected. So the tournament could have an impact even on the emissions, which is quite encouraging, I think, to see, and it's a nice behavioral result that we were excited about. Okay, so one of the other results that we were interested in and also surprised about is that social observability is not very effective in this setting, and it can have limits as an effective regulatory tool. Some of it is because there seems to be limited social stigma associated with misreporting. And maybe the social norm is such that it's okay to misreport, so then obviously there is no stigma associated with it. And in tournament in particular, greater misreporting is actually helpful to other people. So that makes it difficult to understand how to counter the high stigma associated with misreporting. So the lesson that we learned was that providing social information can have very subtle effects. So you have to be careful how to interpret social information, and you have to be cautious about having policies which actually give information about others in the group. There are many regulatory policies where this is being encouraged, and one has to be careful about how this is designed and the interpretation of the results from these kind of setups. Okay, so I want to go on with the setting where there is a principal-agent relationship, and so this is a setting where you have a social dilemma, but there are decisions which are made by firms and not just individuals. And these firms are composed of principals and agents. Okay? Now, there are many examples of such situations where you have externalities and where you have a principal-agent problem. A recent example that comes to mind is the Volkswagen emissions scandal that pretty much, I guess, rocked the environmental and the automotive industry. And what they basically did was that their cars worked perfectly when they were being inspected. But actually, when you were driving them on the roads, then the fuel efficiency was not good at all. So they were basically cheating the public and the regulators. And the US EPA was obviously very annoyed about this and charged them with many, they had many legal suits against them. And this was ironic because they were just awarded the Green Car of the Year award based on these wonderful inspections that they managed to clear. So this was a very interesting idea. But of course, all of these compliance decisions, these are not made by one person. They might be made by engineers, they might be made by managers, by the CEO. There are many people involved. But who is the one who finally gets the blame? It's the company often, and individuals are not, in most cases, individuals are not held liable. Okay? If you want to think about beyond the environmental arena, you have many examples in the global financial crisis, where again, this principal agent problem was highlighted very well. There were lots of cases where banks and financial institutions were taken to court and they had to pay a lot of money to settle civil suits. But again, there are people who are responsible for this behavior were not held into account. Okay? So in many of these situations, there is an agency risk because it's not very clear who's responsible. Is it the principal? Is it the agent? Is it the combination? If the agent is the one who is acting, then it's important to be sure that the agent is incentivized well, right? So, because otherwise they may not take the actions which are important to take to avoid this accident. The problem in all of these cases is that actions are not observable. So what we're going to do in this paper, and this is a new paper that we're working on, and we're trying to examine regulatory compliance and social dilemmas where you have an agency risk and where you do not have an agency risk. Okay? And the main research question here is, does agency risk exacerbate social dilemma problems? And importantly, can we design appropriate wage contracts between principals and agents to solve this kind of a problem? Okay, so the framework that we're going to use here is one where the agent is the one that has to make the decision, has to make the effort decision, and the agent's choices are going to determine the likelihood of a bad outcome occurring. You can think of an environmental spill, like a pollution spill, as being a good example of this outcome. And the social dilemma in this case arises as if the bad outcome occurs, not only does the principal's earnings fall, but also the other principals in the group are going to suffer damages. Okay, and why is this? Because maybe they're also harmed by the environmental problem, or it could be because of the fact that now there is greater scrutiny on all the firms in this industry. There's more regulatory scrutiny, and because of that, everybody is going to be harmed by the actions taken by the agent. Okay, so I mentioned that effort is unobservable, and you can't really write a contract based on effort. You can write a contract based on outcome, but not on effort. Okay, so we consider two kinds of contracts. So there's one which we call the unconditional contract. You can think of it as a fixed wage contract. So here, in the unconditional wage contract, the idea is that the principals can only offer an unconditional wage contract to their agents. However, they can offer a bonus after the outcome has been revealed. That is, whether there's been an accident or not. And in this particular case, if you assume that both principals and agents are selfish, then the principal is going to offer the minimum wage, and the agent is going to choose the lowest effort possible. And also the bonus is going to be 0 because they are not really interested in being reciprocal or being kind to the agent. However, there is obviously evidence that not everybody acts according to these social preferences, so selfish preferences. So if you think about other predictions that have become quite common in the experimental literature and also beyond the experimental literature, you can think of these predictions in terms of the fair wage effort hypothesis, which is also called the gift exchange. So what is a fair wage effort hypothesis? So this is based on theoretical models by Akerlof and Yellen. And Ernst Fair and his co-authors a few years back, well, several years back now, he had this very interesting and very insightful paper which tested this concept of fair wage and effort hypothesis. And the idea was that you find a positive relationship between work effort and wages when you run these in an experimental setting. So this is a figure from their paper. There is effort on the y-axis and wages on the x-axis. So these are wages offered by the principal, effort exerted by the agent, and you can see that the scatter plot here can be fitted very well by a linear regression line. Okay, so reciprocity can elicit higher wages and effort than what standard theory predicts, and this can help to improve welfare. So in most of this gift exchange literature, this is a pattern that is observed when the relationship between effort and output is deterministic. Okay, so even though agent's effort is not contractable, it's still observable, maybe after the event, after the wages have been chosen. But in our setting, they're going to be the effort is not observable, but it's also a noisy effort. It's going to have some random shocks. And in addition to this, there's going to be an accident that is going to create externalities for other people in the group, which is something that the gift exchange literature doesn't particularly consider. Okay? So in our context, what do we expect? We would expect that, yes, it is true that principals likely will offer more than the minimum wage, and agents will respond more than the minimum effort. However, because in our setting we have this non-observability of agents' effort, we may find that this gift exchange effect is rather weak as compared to what others have found. And we would now be interested to see whether that is true or not. The other contract that we design is one which is based on conditional outcome, which is based on outcome, and this is conditional on the actual outcome. So this we call a conditional wage contract. Wages can be conditioned on the outcome, and also in this case, you can decide, principals can decide to offer a bonus. So in this particular kind of a contract, it is possible to align the incentives of the agent with those of the principal. And the way to do it would be to have a wage differential which is equal to the total harm suffered by the principal from the accident. So basically, the principal would decide to pay a very high wage if the outcome is good, and a very low wage if the outcome is bad. That's what this means. So the wage differential has to be enough so that the harm is taken away. So in this particular case, for our setting, our prediction is that the optimal wage is going to be 0 for the bad outcome, and the optimal wage for the good outcome would be the total harm suffered by the principal. Okay? So we also have a treatment where we don't have an agent, and this is to try and compare what happens when you don't have any agency risk. You still have the social dilemma, that is the principal's actions, when they decide to put in effort, is going to have an impact on the other principals in the group. But there is no agency problem here. Okay? So this is a simple prediction here that principals are going to choose effort levels that are smaller than the socially optimal level, because as we know, people have an incentive to free ride when there's a social dilemma. Okay? I will skip that about accidents. I'll also skip this because I've basically talked about this, and this is just formalizing the hypothesis a little bit. Okay, so let me just very quickly outline the design, and then I'll show you some results. So we have the design where you have principals and agents, and as I've mentioned before, any accident is going to reduce the profit of each principal in the group. There are 4 people in a group. In the principal-only treatment, there are 4 principals. In the agency treatments, there are 8 people. 4 of them are principals, and 4 of them are agents. Okay, so we try to keep things constant as much as we can across these different treatments. So the accidents are always only harmful to the principal and not to the agents, so as to keep the total harm suffered by the group the same across the treatments. Okay, so I shall maybe not talk about these, but we tried to have a design where gift exchange would be likely to occur. So we had repeated pairings between principals and agents. So the participants make decisions in 15 periods, and there are 3 stages in each of these periods. The first stage is where the principal offers a contract. The second one is where the agent chooses their effort level. Of course, effort is costly. And the final stage is where there is an accident that occurs, and the probability of having an accident depends on the effort that you've put in. Okay, so you can observe the accident, but you don't observe the effort chosen by the agent. Okay, so now let me highlight some results from this project. What we find is that overall, when there's a social dilemma, and this is actually consistent with many findings in this experimental literature, when you have a social dilemma, often the actions space is closer to the Nash equilibrium level than to the socially optimal level. But what is interesting here is that the unconditional treatment, or the gift exchange treatment, that is no different from the Nash prediction. Okay? So this is, again, effort choices, but here now I'm just showing you the whole distribution. And here, what I just want to highlight is that in the baseline, there are very few 0 effort choices. So all principals are putting in some effort, right? So there are very few of them are exerting zero effort. In the conditional and unconditional, that changes a bit, particularly in the unconditional, where 20% are zero effort numbers here. Okay, so that's quite high. But in general, what we find is that the baseline and the conditional wage treatment are very similar, so they're statistically not distinguishable, but they are both different from the gift exchange or the unconditional wage treatment. So the probability of accidents pretty much mirrors the effort level. There are some slight differences, but the main result is that the unconditional treatment, you have much higher accidents as compared to the conditional and the baseline. Okay? In terms of wages paid, we didn't find the results that our hypotheses were predicting, because the average wages are very similar in both the conditional and the unconditional treatments. And that's those two ones in the middle. These are the wages in the two treatments. But of course, when we separate out the wages for the good outcome and the bad outcome, then you do see that principals are paying much higher for the good outcome as compared to the bad outcome. For the bad outcome, it's quite close to zero. That's that bottom line there. Bonuses, we expect according to standard theory that people should not be paying any bonuses. People know the end period in this experiment. If they have selfish preferences, they should not really be paying bonuses. But of course, we do see some bonuses. So there is some reciprocity happening, but there is no difference across the treatments. Okay? So I won't go into this. It's basically the bonuses for the bad outcome and the good outcome. And as you can see from the graph, it's all very similar. Now, we are always interested in what is actually happening in terms of the environmental outcome and what is happening in terms of the earnings, right? That's our main interest. So the wages and the bonuses are just instruments to get us here. So these are welfare comparisons across treatments. And what is interesting is that the conditional and the baseline, though in terms of magnitudes they are a bit different, but they are not statistically different. So the baseline and the conditional, the first two columns, in terms of accidents realized and in terms of earnings, they're no different from each other. But this unconditional, that is a gift exchange treatment, this reacts very badly. So the earnings are very low and the accidents are very high. Okay? Okay, so let me just quickly summarize the findings from the second project. So basically what we are finding is that the conditional contract is very useful because it allows us to converge to the baseline treatment where there is no agency risk. So even with an agent, we can manage to incentivize the agent and align the agent's incentives to what the principal wants them to do. Okay? And how do they do this? They use a combination of conditional wage and bonus to solve the agency problem. This is slightly different. So this channel is slightly different from what we had predicted because we thought they'll be giving them zero bonuses and much higher wages. But they actually use both of these to incentivize the agent. Okay? So therefore, when you have a conditional contract, when you can write a conditional contract, conditional on the outcome, then agency risk does not seem to exacerbate the social dilemma problem. And that to us was a very interesting and important finding. In the unconditional treatment, the gift exchange treatment, this was not effective at all. And this is very contrary to what a lot of evidence on gift exchange says, because it leads to worsening of the social dilemma in our case. So it seems to us that in this realistic and challenging environment that most of us face in the real world, reciprocity in itself might not be sufficient to incentivize the agent in these kind of situations. And you need more than that. You need some contracts where you can write these conditional wage offers. Okay? So overall, in some sense, in both our research projects, what we find is that well-designed regulatory schemes and wage contracts can improve compliance, and they can diminish the social dilemma problem that can be quite critical in the environmental area. However, in both the projects, what we found was that the schemes or the regulatory schemes which were based on social information, peer pressure, and reciprocity, they in some sense have unexpected and subtle effects. So one has to be a bit careful about how to interpret them, and how to actually operationalize them in the field. Okay? And I think it'll be very interesting in future research to try and explore these effects more systematically. And to me, there are lots of open questions. In the first project, for example, we talked about the high stigma that can be faced by people when you give them more information about what is happening in the group. And you also have, on the other hand, the updating of beliefs about the social norm. In our project, we didn't, our research objective was not to tease these apart, but in future work, this might be something that people are interested in doing to try and understand what are the actual mechanisms which are driving these kind of results. And also, more importantly, if we can think of government interventions, if the regulator can intervene in some way to update the beliefs and update the social norms for the firms. Okay, so to improve the belief formation process so that you can actually improve compliance in these areas. That's all I have to say.
So, on behalf of the organizations and the local organizing committee, I would like, where are you? There you are. I would like to thank you, Lata, for an extremely interesting presentation. We have a small gift as a token of appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are, as expected, running a bit behind schedule, but I think we have time for a few questions. So we have 3 microphones in the house somewhere. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and they will come with the microphone. Yes, please.
Thanks, Lata. Nice talk. I want to ask a question about the nature of the contract that's offered in the principal agent model. You're basically putting all the risk on the agents. And in the field, we wouldn't have any way of controlling for this sort of thing. But in the laboratory, there are mechanisms whereby you can assess risk attitudes of the subjects. I'm wondering if you've explored that at all.
Yes, so that's a very important point, actually. So we do elicit risk preferences of both agents and principals. So in our context, actually, the risk preferences don't seem to have a big impact on their decisions. But it's true that one can design treatments where you have a mix of risk, where the principal takes up some of the risk and the agent takes up other elements of the risk. That's an important point. And in our regressions, we do control for that. Yeah.
Any other question? I cannot see anyone waving.
Somebody there? There's somebody there.
Oh, it's right.
Yeah, thanks for a very nice presentation. I have a question. In some of the experimental results, you don't exactly know why people behaved the way they did, why the results differ from the hypotheses. And obviously that gives you an idea of where to go next with your research. But it strikes me in this, I don't know the literature well, but it strikes me that there's not very much qualitative evidence here. Do you actually ask people afterwards, why did you do that? And why did you behave this way? And do you learn something that way?
So in most experiments that I run, we try to have a survey at the end of the experiment. And we do collect, in addition to demographic factors and other important information about the participants, we also ask them open-ended questions. So for example, in the first project, we asked them about social norms in some sense, because we wanted to understand whether the social information treatments are going to be affected by different norms that different groups have. And we actually found that the results were very consistent from their revealed behavior in the experiment. So it was true that in our experiment, most of the participants didn't think it was a big deal to not pay a parking ticket, for example. Or we had a whole host of questions for them, and we found that the social norms about compliance compliance are not very high. And we also, because we wanted to figure out, how we had these two different dimensions. One was a formal dimension about audit mechanism and fines and things like that. So that's more economic or monetary, and then we had the social dimension. So we tried to we asked questions to tease out the two, and we found that most people are motivated to obey laws if there is a monetary aspect to it, but they're not motivated to follow rules if they think that that should be the right social norm. Okay, and we wondered, whether our subject pool was different or other such things. But it's true that in the literature also there is mixed evidence, both in the lab and in the field. So there are some experiments, very nice experiments in the electricity area about smiley faces. So you can get your, your bill summary for the month, and if you have consumed more electricity than the other people in your neighborhood, then you get a sad face, and other places you get a happy face if you've consumed less. And even in those kind of experiments, I think people have found that you try and converge to what you think is the average. So people who are being actually very good might now start consuming more electricity, right? So they start complying less. So social norms are very interesting, but also sometimes you can have perverse effects, which one needs to be careful about and think carefully about.
We are running a bit behind, so I think it's time to thank Lata once again with a big round of applause. Lunch is served at the same place as yesterday, so go up again and in the A and J entrances, and there will be lunch there.